Do you think the terror that serial killers create can come back to haunt them? In this program, we explore the fate of serial killers who, despite causing immense fear in society, experienced the same terror in prison and were killed in the same manner. In the shadows of Colombia and Ecuador during the 1970s and 1980s, a name whispered in corners: Daniel Camargo Barbosa, known as Sadistic El Chito. It was said that he had taken the lives of between 72 and 180 young people. Barbosa's childhood was marked by an abusive stepmother and a cold father. Was this the beginning of the darkness that later consumed him? His method was simple but deadly, luring young girls with promises of work or money, taking them to remote areas, and then absolute darkness. In 1974, he was caught by the law, but Barbosa was too cunning to remain confined. In 1984, he escaped from prison and resumed his nightmare in Ecuador. In 1986, a girl who had escaped death revealed the secret. Barbosa was arrested and confessed to killing 71 girls in Ecuador. His sentence was only 16 years in prison, but fate had a different ending for him. On November 13, 1998, Barbosa was killed in prison by a fellow inmate who was said to be the nephew of one of his victims. Robert Pickton, known as the Pig Farm Killer, Robert Pickton was a Canadian serial killer convicted of murdering 6 women, though it is believed he killed up to 49. Pickton ran a pig farm in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, which became the site of his horrific crimes. He targeted vulnerable women, mainly from Vancouver's downtown East Side, luring them to his farm where he killed and dismembered them. His arrest in 2002 marked the beginning of one of Canada's largest and most gruesome criminal investigations. Authorities discovered the remains and personal belongings of numerous missing women on his property. Details revealed during the investigation were horrifying, including claims that Pickton fed his victims' remains to his pigs and possibly mixed human meat with pork sold to the public. Pickton's trial began in 2007, and he was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder, receiving a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 25 years, the maximum sentence in Canada. Despite his conviction for 6 murders, Pickton had previously confessed to an undercover police officer that he had killed 49 women and intended to make it an even 50. This case exposed significant flaws in Canada's judicial system, particularly in handling cases involving marginalized and vulnerable women. Many of Pickton's victims were sex workers and drug addicts, and their disappearances were initially not taken seriously by authorities. On May 19, 2024, Pickton faced a cruel fate, almost as brutal as what his victims endured. He was attacked by another inmate at the Port Cartier institution in Quebec. The assailant, Martin Charles, had a history of attacking other inmates. He struck Pickton with a broken broom handle, causing injuries that ultimately led to Pickton's death. O'Donnell Harvey, known as the Angel of Death, Donald Harvey was an American serial killer who worked as a nurse's aide. He claimed to have killed 87 people between 1970 and 1987, though authorities could only confirm 37. His methods vary, including poisoning, suffocation, and administering lethal doses of drugs. Harvey began his killings at Marymount Hospital in London, initially claiming they were mercy killings of terminally ill patients. However, over time, his motives became more sinister, killing patients who annoyed him or were difficult to care for. Harvey used various methods, such as poisoning with arsenic and cyanide, injecting high doses of insulin, turning off ventilators, and even injecting fluids contaminated with hepatitis B and HIV. His crimes were discovered when a coroner noticed suspicious levels of cyanide in a patient. Harvey was arrested in 1987 and confessed to dozens of murders. To avoid the death penalty, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. On March 28, 2017, Harvey was attacked and severely beaten in his cell at the Toledo Correctional Institution. He died 2 days later, marking a violent end to his life. Josmao Antonio Rodr Chinese letter Guez Vega, known as El Mataviejas, or the Old Lady Killer, Jo's Chinese letter Antonio Rodr Chinese letter Guez Vega, was a Spanish serial killer who terrorized Santander between 1987 and 1988. Born on December 3, 1957, his early life was troubled. After being thrown out of his home for beating his sick father, Viga found himself in and out of prison. After his release in 1986, his wife left him, which seemed to trigger his killing spree. Viga targeted elderly women between the ages of 61 and 93. He carefully studied their routines and often posed as a helpful neighbor to gain access to their homes. Once inside, his behavior turned deadly. Viga's twisted hobby included keeping souvenirs from his victims, which he displayed in a red room, a gruesome collection reflecting his dark obsessions. His arrest in May 1988 ended a terrifying chapter for Santander. In his 1991 trial, Viga was convicted of 16 murders and sentenced to 440 years in prison. The trial revealed the brutality and calculated nature of his crimes. Despite his horrific acts, Viga maintained a normal appearance and even married a mentally disabled woman whom he tortured while pretending to be a devoted husband. Just a few years before his potential release, Viga was transferred to a prison section for dangerous inmates. On October 24, 2002, Viga was killed by fellow inmates who stabbed him 113 times. His lack of remorse and reputation as a prison informant and rapist sealed his fate within 24 hours of his arrival in the news section. During the attack, prison guards stood by and watched as Viga was repeatedly stabbed. He was buried the next day in a cheap coffin, with only 2 gravediggers attending his funeral, marking a quiet end for such a sadistic killer. Jeffrey Dahmer, born on May 21, 1960 in Wisconsin, Jeffrey Dahmer was destined to become one of America's most notorious serial killers. A quiet and reclusive child with a strange fascination for dead animals were these early signs of what was to come. In 1978, after graduating high school, his first murder occurred. Stephen Hicks, a hitchhiker, was his first victim. This was just the beginning. Over the next 13 years, Dahmer killed 16 more men and boys. His methods included luring, poisoning, and strangling, but it didn't end there. Necrophilia, dismemberment, and in some cases cannibalism followed. Dahmer's apartment became a house of horrors. In 1991, Tracy Edwards, a victim who escaped, led police to Dahmer's apartment. What they found shocked even seasoned officers. Photos of dismembered bodies, human remains in the fridge and freezer, scattered SKULLS Chinese letter nightmare come true. In 1992, Dahmer confessed to 15 murders and received 15 consecutive life sentences. However, fate had a different end for him. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was killed in prison by a fellow inmate. El Mao Opal Dian. In the 1960s, the name El Chinese letter OPOLD Dion struck fear into the hearts of Canadians. Known as the Monster of Pont Rouge, Dion was a career criminal with a history of theft and sexual assault. But did anyone know he was on the verge of becoming one of Canada's most feared killers? Released from prison in 1960, was this a chance for a fresh start, or the beginning of a new nightmare? Dion's method was cunning and deceptive. Posing as a photographer, he lured young boys with promises of fame and adventure. But behind the camera lens, Dion's true face emerged. Between 1963 and 1964, he claimed 4 VICTIM's Chinese letter WO women and 2 girls. The community was gripped with fear. Parents kept their children indoors and the police were chasing a shadow always one step ahead. But April 1964 was a turning point. A boy who managed to escape exposed Dion, leading to his arrest. Dion confessed to his murders and led the police to the bodies. The trial was swift, with undeniable evidence and shocking confessions, resulting in a life sentence. However, fate had another end for Dion. On November 17, 1972, Dion was killed in prison by a fellow inmate, ending his bloody life with a bloody end. Thank you for joining us in this program. For more prison facts and celebrity criminal cases, subscribe to our YouTube channel and activate the bell to be the first to know.